So, the next part of our historical discussion of South America focuses on the great cities. And the way that I do that is through the discussion of the Inca. Before this, some of the tribes or groups were using cities, I guess we'd say, but the Inca are the best example of city building in South America. By the way, the word Inca literally just means like leader or king. So they actually called their leaders the Inca, so the people who were ruling over them. And so when the Spanish arrived, they heard this word being used, right? This idea of like the Inca, their rulers. And so they started calling them the Inca. So that is where the name comes from and why we call them what we call them. Often the name is rooted in the dialogue of the people, but again, it often comes through colonial means, how we actually describe these people. It's not really how they talked about themselves, is my point, right? It's how the language of what they were using for a very specific group of people started to be co opted by this colonial group that came in. So that's where Inca comes from. It really just means ruler. The Incan Empire was huge if you look at geography, but it wasn't maybe huge the way we think about it. If you think about like American hugeness, we think of like an east to west bigness. For the Inca, it was a north to south orientation, right? So they ruled about 2,600 miles, starting from Ecuador in the north and ranging all the way down to Chile in the south, using modern day countries, but you get the point. Notice that most of the land they're ruling over is on the west coast, on the Pacific coast, and again, it's that north south corridor that I'd mentioned before is that arid, dry region. They're not ranging into the Amazon rainforest basin. Those were completely different groups of people who lived there, mainly just small tribal groups that had no real names at the time. And again, the two geographies were very different, the two climates were very different. And so the Inca stayed in the dry, arid, desert like environment, which was the west coast. And this is why a lot of what they made, survives because the environment is more amenable, right, to preservation than again the Amazon rainforest basin, which is hot, humid, everything's going to decay. The Inca, right, arose as a culture about 1300 AD, and were decimated by the Spanish about 1528. So again, not a huge span of time, right, that they were living. And when the Spanish arrive here, they're led by Pizarro. So if you look at your colonial history, right, Pizarro arrives, and through disease, outright killing of people, et cetera, and so forth, the population of the Inca drops from 6 million people to about 1.5 million Inca in only about 30 years. So when people who study colonial history talk about contact, being a bad thing, these are the kind of numbers that are pointed to, that basically through disease, through attrition, of those kind of natural means, but also through just bad conflicts, that lead to death through violent means. These people are usually quite decimated by the colonial contact. And this is something that indigenous people kind of carry around with them, as part of their story. Indigenous means of the area, so more and more you'll hear me say that word as we're talking about the Americas, because people like the Inca were the indigenous people. They were native to that place, and the Spanish were not. They were coming as outsiders. So today, people who are Incan descendants, they carry a lot of baggage, related to colonialism, right, to incursion. And you have to sort of understand that if you're going to be studying them. And again, you can point to this kind of data, this kind of information about like, why do they have bad thoughts sometimes about this? Well, there you go. It's part of their history. So one of the things, though, I find fascinating about people in the Americas is it seems like they try very hard to figure out how to work the whole spirit of their indigenous beliefs and the things that they wanted to take from colonialists, and how to put those things together. The best example I can say, for instance, is like indigenous gods and then like the Catholic gods that the Spanish were going to worship, right? So how do you take indigenous religious beliefs and marry them to Catholicism? So what I find in the Americas is they try to find a way to weave the two together, to blend them, and that's always been fascinated by the strength in that, right? The purposefulness in that and the power in that. Now, when I think about the people in South America and really all the Americas, one of the things I'm always struck by is that kind of civic spirit. And when you talk about civic, you're talking about like the things you do for your community, right? So they're very civic. They very much are considering what are the things that, one can do to give back to their community. Just like in Egypt. And I'd spoken a little bit about, there's a lot of comparisons to be made between, I think, South American culture and Egyptian culture. Just like in Egypt, where building the pyramids was not slave labor, it was considered a way to like probably pay your taxes or contribute to the prosperity of the pharaoh or something like that. We know that here it was thought of the same way. That the people who were building Machu Picchu, let's say, these big walls at the famous site of Machu Picchu, which of course we'll talk about in greater depth, that they were doing it because they wanted to give back to their community. So we know that like lesser people on the social scale, they probably would have worked here more and probably actually would have worked here as a job. But that high-ranking people also probably would have came and put in a day of labor because they believe that that's how you sort of, in a sense, paid back to your community. So I often compare it to paying taxes. This is how you give back to your community. We pay money; they gave labor, right? So you have to think about how connected they were to each other. When I think about the Inca, for instance, they're very connected to the welfare and well-being of all Inca. So there's a very big civic spirit or community spirit that you can see when you look at them. The kind of religious system they had was polytheistic or many-godded, as we say. Poly means many, mono means one. So when the Spanish arrive here, of course, they come into contact with a polytheism, while they were monotheists. And one of the gods that they worshiped was Viracocha, which was like a god of nature. Now, if you look up in the mountainside, you can actually find Viracocha. So if you look kind of like up from me to the left, right, you might see the face of Viracocha about midway up through the mountain. It's shown in profile. And keep this in mind that a lot of the ways that they would show their imagery is through profile, as we put it. It's a side view. It's not full on, right? It's a side view or a profile view. So you'll notice that when looking at Viracocha. Hopefully you can find Viracocha. Again, go up from me. You'll see there's kind of like a fortress up in the hills, and then go to the left of that, and you should be able to see Viracocha in profile, kind of set into the mountainside. Now, why even show you this? Because, these gods and goddesses that they believed in, they often linked them to nature and to spirituality and almost kind of these abstract concepts, which is what a lot of polytheisms did. Like a god of the moon, a god of the sun, etc. and so forth. So Viracocha was like a god of nature, right? And so when the Spanish arrive here, they're kind of encountering this very loose religious system, because the way that the Inca actually dealt with religion is they didn't allow for religious persecution. They understood that people throughout their empire were maybe worshiping different gods, and they didn't really mind that. And we find that if you're trying to convert people to come to your empire, that's the way to go. Obviously, this is going to cause problems with the Spanish, who are going to push Catholicism. So again, I wanted to sort of have you understand that the original religious system they had was a very open-ended, type of religious system. It was much more about like nature worship and such. And so when the Spanish come and have this, extremely institutionalized Catholicism that has rules and has very specific beliefs, this is going to be a clash that happens. And I also wanted you to be thinking about this when we talked about colonialism, because again, as I mentioned, one of the things that South American groups I think do well is they try to blend together their indigenous beliefs with the Catholicism or the Christianity that they inherit from colonialism, right? So they're trying to figure out that issue, how to create that connection. I also want to mention that they did have a communication system, but it's probably unlike anything you've seen before, because when we think of information, we think about phonetic writing. We think about like English language, let's say, or Romance languages and such. We think about phonetic writing. Of course, other language systems use pictographs. So look at like Chinese, Japanese, that are coupled with phonograms, let's say. But this is a system that's, to me, more like Braille, because it uses knots along chords. So you're looking at these like pieces of cord or string, and along of them you can see there's these little knots that are woven into the string. And so how they communicated with each other was through this system of these knots on these pieces of string. So if you've seen Braille, you move your finger over the dots, and the dots have codings, right, that the person learns. And of course, then the codings are symbols that relate to letters, relate to words, etc. Um, the quipus, they work in a very similar fashion. And what you're seeing here actually is a whole bunch of them, right? Arrayed, you'll notice, on something that looks like a piece of jewelry. That's kind of what it was. We assume this was like a necklace or like a bracelet. And the people that would have worn these were called runners. Because the empire was so big, about 2,600 miles, right, stem to stern, they had these people they called runners that we think would put on these little pieces of jewelry with these quipu messages on them, and then they'd run from different places to different places throughout the empire and deliver different messages. So they could take it off the little, bracelet or a little necklace and then hand it over to the person it was intended to, and then run off to the next place. And then maybe come back through, and the person could respond, and then they would take that message back with them. But again, the way that they would read these messages is through reading the knots on the cord and deciphering them. Do we know how to translate this? No. So again, a lot of what we know of the Inca is actually through the Spanish talking about them rather than their own documents. But it's really fascinating to know that they were communicating, but again, it's in a way that, is sort of not familiar to us when we think about language. So again, it's just kind of a cool thing to consider. This is the way that they were messaging each other or talking to each other. And again, we don't have a lot of information about that. In the next video, I'm going to go ahead and break down the various cities of the Inca. So we'll look at Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and Machu Picchu. Yeah, try hard on pronouncing those ones, right? They are work. You do have to work at it.